Reading in the NIV version, the book of Colossians, chapter 3, verse 12 through 17. Therefore, as God's chosen people, holy and dearly loved, clothe yourselves with compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience. Bear with each other and forgive one another if any of you has grievance against someone. Forgive as the Lord forgave you. And overall, these virtues put on love, which binds them all together in perfect unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, since as members of one body you are called to peace, and be thankful. Let the message of Christ dwell among you richly as you teach and admonish one another with all wisdom through psalms, hymns, and songs from the Spirit, singing to God with gratitude in your hearts. And whatever you do, whether in word or deed, do it all in the name of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks to God the Father through him.
Thank you, Rochelle. Just real quickly, as a little bit of background for the sermon today, and I believe in 2 weeks, Lee and I have been trying to listen to what comes out of the congregation as far as the concerns, the topics that are pertinent, and I even did a little bit of a survey online recently. The issue of strengthening family life in today's world was one that came up, and so Lee and I were looking for a little bit more specific ways of addressing that. And so I did a survey, and one of the ones that came to the forefront was healthy communication. And Lee is going to cover the topic of holding on and letting go in 2 weeks on the 22nd, I believe. So this morning, the topic is healthy communication as part of this understanding of strengthening family life. We didn't necessarily intend it to happen on Mother's Day, but I think it's appropriate that we talk about strengthening family life generally on a day like today. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a book that I've found to be very helpful in relating to relationships, and this applies to husbands and wives and friends and grandparents and children and anybody, hopefully. It's not just sort of about the nuclear family, but any of our relationships. The book that I using a little bit as an outline is called Extraordinary Relationships: A New Way of Thinking About Human Interactions. And the key concept, the key idea in healthy relationships is openness. It makes me think a little bit of Psalm 139. There's this idea, "O Lord, you have searched me and known me. You know my thoughts before they even enter into my head." There's this idea that, like it or not, we are an open book to God. And in some ways, allowing ourselves to be open to God improves our health with our spiritual life, openness in our relationships, and as part of our healthy communication, improves the health of our relationships. So under this idea of openness, open, healthy communication is verbal, it's direct, it's non-reactive, and it's mutual. So what I'm going to do is go through and look at each of these postures, these principles, and I'm basing it on a book and not the Bible, and yet I find it to be that truth comes out when I'm reading some of these things, and I go, it doesn't take me very long to go, oh, that sounds a lot like this particular Bible verse. So what I'm going to do is go through some of these and look at some Bible verses that would help and explain a little bit what healthy open communication looks like when it's verbal, direct, non-reactive, and mutual. Verbal. I think of 1 Corinthians 13:11. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I thought as a child. I reasoned as a child. When I grew up, I put childish ways behind me. Now, I say that with the caveat that Jesus said, anyone who comes to me, people need to come to me like a little child. So I'm not bashing childhood by any stretch of the imagination. But it's this idea that toddlers, children have a particular way of communicating, right? And we know that they're really good at communicating. right? They're very good at it. Now, typically, the younger the child is, what are they communicating? They're communicating non-verbally, and they're communicating base urges and desires that they really don't have much control over. They just see something they want, and they're going to point or push or grab or whatever it takes to get that thing that they want, right? Now, ideally, as we grow up, children begin to understand there's more going on inside of me than simply just what I want. I have experiences, I have thoughts of my own that don't relate necessarily to just the thing that I want right now. And realize that there's emotions going on, there's more going on than just our base desires. And so as we grow up, ideally, we move from simply naming base desires to being more thoughtful about what's going on inside of me, what experiences are going on, what feelings am I have, what fears, joys, what exactly is going on, and then communicating that verbally is the way that we define ourselves to other people, the way we survive and interact with other people to bring more meaning to our lives than simply getting food in our bellies and getting enough sleep. So ideally, we're doing that. Now, a lot of us still do a lot of grunting and pushing and grabbing because we're still operating on our base desires. Okay? I notice that for myself quite a bit, like I grunt and whatever, and because I didn't get what I wanted, and then I look and see my 1-year-old doing the exact same thing, and I'm like, oh, okay. There's supposed to be a difference here in the way we communicate, the way we, interact with our peers and with our family, but clearly that's not happening. So the goal for us is to be actually improving in naming clearly what exactly is going on and being thoughtful about that, not simply just reacting with our guttural instincts. I'm upset. Well, yes, I can tell by your body language. But what's going on? What are the thoughts going on in your mind? Why are you upset? How might we move to getting through this? Okay, so saying something meaningful. Something meaningful. Now that can be scary because it can be part of our deepest fears. It can be part of our deepest dreams. And yet if we don't verbalize them, they will stay buried. And then maybe they'll even come out in unhealthy ways. So what keeps you from saying something meaningful to another person? Healthy communication is direct. Matthew 18:15, if a member of the church sins against you, point out the fault directly in private. Speak for yourself and speak directly to the person that you need to speak to. Okay, how many of you have heard this or even said something like this? Honey, I know you're hungry, but Daddy hasn't finished washing the dishes from last night, so we can't eat yet. Okay, I've never heard that in my house. Maybe something similar, but I won't throw Becky under the bus. But I've certainly said things like that. What was I doing there? I was recognizing that there was an anxiety. That those two people were recognizing there was an anxiety between spouse and spouse, and finding a way to somehow include the child in that anxiety, to pass a little bit of that anxiety off on the child instead of naming directly what the concern is. I've created this triangle of anxiety. Okay? And what does that do except instead of actually managing my own anxiety about something that's going on, I've passed it on to a 3-year-old that now all of a sudden has to manage what do I do with this? That doesn't ideally have the skills yet to manage that, but I as a 35-year-old should be able to manage my own anxiety. Okay? So be direct. We don't need to create unnecessary triangles. Think through if and when you approach someone in a relationship about a particular thing that's going on that you need to communicate about, how many other people have you talked to before you went to that person? Let's try to minimize that. Let's try to minimize that as much as possible. Now, it's not easy, I realize that. I remember a friend needing to address something with our relationship, and he was literally shaking the whole time because he was worried about how I was going to respond, because I might not respond well. So I'm not idealizing that this is going to be just an easy thing. Like, just stop talking to other people and only talk to the person. I know relationships are hard work. Relationships are hard work. And so, we need to be able to be non-reactive when we're engaging, especially in difficult conversations. James 1:19, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, or slow to anger. And I love this translation in the Message. Lead with your ears, follow up with your tongue, and let anger straggle along in the rear. Or if this were an internet meme or a t-shirt, it would say, keep calm, listen on. Or something like that. Heightened anxiety makes communication really difficult. It makes it really difficult. It clouds what you're saying, it clouds what you're hearing when our anxiety goes up. And I love this quote from Viktor Frankl, between stimulus and response is a space. Okay, between something that happens to us and our response, there is a space. Now, in that space is the power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. The goal here is to see how much we can widen that space. Recognize when a stimulus comes in that raises our anxiety, recognize that, and be able to pay attention to what is going on inside of me, and how can I increase that space to be able to think more clearly about what kind of response I'm going to give. So what is your primary trigger? What are your primary triggers? Is it a particular person? Is it a particular time of day, like right after work or first thing in the morning before coffee? Is it a particular topic, like money or farming practices or sex? What are your triggers? Here's one of mine that maybe is familiar. Why? 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 Evelyn has gotten really good at that. I mean, really good. And she's like really passionate about it too, right? Like she gets this big smile on her face. Why? I kind of think she knows it's my trigger, and so she keeps saying it. I'm pretty sure. But it's, why is this trigger for a lot of us? Why? Because it's questioning the reasons that we are the way we are, or that we're doing what we're doing. So it can get under our skins. It can be challenging for someone to ask why. I'll just make a little side note and say, and because I feel like I should, and I really want to. If there's one thing that my mom, on this Mother's Day, if there's one thing that my mom taught me, or exemplified to me, it was this remaining calm during those challenging questions of why. When I would ask her questions about life or faith or anything that had a why to it, she was very, 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 very calm in those moments. She didn't say, because we've always done that way, leave it alone. I don't know why, stop asking. She took it on as a challenge for growth a lot of times and said, that's a good question. I'm not really sure. Here's what I think. I don't know exactly. And she modeled for me sort of keeping our anxiety low when possible triggers come up. Being okay, being at peace about not knowing. Being at peace about who we are. Ultimately, that's the issue, right? Any of our triggers usually touch on something deep within us that relates to our identity. And so how do we identify those triggers? How do we name them for ourselves and say, you know what? This is something that shoots my anxiety through the roof. How can I understand that? How can I get to the root of what's causing that so that I can remain calm in situations that might otherwise be full of anxiety? We owe it to ourselves. We owe it to our families to get to the root of what our triggers are so that we are not reacting with grunts and shoves, even if they're verbal shoves or verbal grabbing, that we respond with thoughtful, careful, loving responses. Non-reactive. The last one is mutual. Seeing every person, each person, as an equal partner in the process. So I think of 1 Corinthians 12, which talks about the body and talks about the parts of the body and says, the hand can't say to the foot, I don't need you. Likewise, the eye cannot say, well, I'm not very important. I'm not needed. I'm of no use. Most of us can say that in theory, but how is that actually practiced in our conversations? A lot of our tendencies are for one person to share more often, the other to listen more often, which isn't necessarily bad, but recognize what your tendency is. Are you listening and truly listening, or when the other person's talking, are you simply waiting your turn to talk? Are you listening? Are you truly listening? Or are you simply taking that time to avoid having to say what you think you should say but don't want to say? There's ways in which we can pretend we're listening, but really be doing one of the other two things, either waiting our turn to speak or avoiding having to speak. What's your tendency? Think about what is your tendency and what would it take to work towards growth, to work against that tendency, to work towards growth for the sake of more genuine communication. So healthy, open communication, it's verbal, it's direct, it's non-reactive, and it's mutual. I believe that healthy communication, open communication, can lead to true healing and true flourishing in our relationships. Just like the doctor needs to know all your medical history to be able to lead towards effective healing, our spiritual health is improved when we're open to God. Our relationship health is improved when we open ourselves to one another. And let's also remember that healthy relationships are not an end in and of themselves. I don't say these things so that you all can experience better relationships and be happier. We are ambassadors of Jesus Christ in the world. So just like Jay was pointing out that the people in Colorado were paying very close attention to how our workers were behaving, what they were saying and doing or not saying and doing. The world is watching. We owe it to the world to be ambassadors for Jesus Christ, to model healthy, open, loving relationships. Because we are embodying the kingdom. We are proclaiming God's healing for the entire world when we take small steps at opening ourselves up and communicating with one another. So may we be those ambassadors. May we be open in our relationships. May we embody Christ's healing and hope in small ways so that God's healing and hope can be known to the entire world.